Hello everyone, and welcome to this new video of Deep in Politics. As I said in the previous video, we will be tackling in the upcoming weeks the 2020 US presidential election. Our main goal will be to understand the outcome of this election and to see how President Biden was able to make it to the White House, so we can then, and based on the result of the 2020 election, try to predict how this election will affect the next election, whether it's the 2022 election or the next election or the next presidential election in 2024. But before diving into this subject, you should know some facts about the procedure that leads to the election of the President of the US. First of all, and unlike what many think, the election of the President in the US is not a direct election, meaning that it's not the American citizens that directly elect the President, as they only elect the presidential electors who will form the General College, which will elect the President of the US. This unique system of election is somewhere in between the direct and the indirect system for a presidential election. First of all, let's take a general overview of the indirect electoral process. In such a system, the president is usually elected by the parliament, which in its turn is elected by the citizens. The citizens elect the deputies for a certain period of time, usually a few years, to represent them and do some task in their name. One of these tasks will be to elect a president. So as you notice, the election of a president is only one of the tasks of the parliament, but not the only one. Furthermore, the election of the parliament is not directly and necessarily linked to the presidential election, as the parliament is generally elected several months and sometimes several years after or before the presidential election. This system, and despite its simplicity, as it does not require a mobilization of the government in order to prepare for millions of people to vote, has different and many disadvantages that you will see right now. The first disadvantage of the indirect electoral process is that it does not give a big credibility to the president, as he's not directly elected from the people, but by their representative, which are the deputies that forms the parliament. And most of the constitutions that follows an indirect electoral process does not give a lot of power and prerogative to the president, and the reason is, as we said, because the president does not take his power from the people but from the parliament. A second disadvantage is that the elected president might not represent the political views of the majority of the citizens at the moment of his election. Indeed, and even though the president in an indirect election is elected by the parliament, which in its turn is elected by the people and by the citizens, many of these deputies might not represent anymore the point of view of the people who elected them. Indeed, as I said previously, it's very common for a long time to elapse between the legislative election and the presidential election, and during this time, a large number of voters might have changed their political opinion, and so the person that they voted for, the deputies that they voted for, might not represent them anymore. For example, in Lebanon, 7 years elapsed between the legislative election and the election of the president that took place in 2016. And of course, during these 7 years, a lot of persons changed their mind, and so the parliament and the deputies that they elected in 2009 did not represent them anymore at the moment of the presidential election. Now let's move to the direct election process. A direct system for a presidential election brings a lot of solution to most of the disadvantages that we saw, as it gives the president a very important credibility, as his election comes directly from the people. It's the people of the country that are electing their president directly, without the need of any representative. And this electoral process gives the president, or the constitutions that follow the direct electoral system, gives the president very important and powerful prerogative, and the reason, of course, is that he's elected by the people. And so the president in a constitution or in a country that follows a direct electoral system has way more power and prerogative than his counterpart in countries with an indirect electoral process. The best example of a country that has a direct presidential election is France, and the current president of France is, of course, President Emmanuel Macron. Now let's go back to the US and ask ourselves, which electoral process does the US follow? Is it the direct electoral process or the indirect one? Well, unlike what many of you might think, the election of the president in the US is not a direct election. Indeed, the citizens of the US do not directly vote for their candidate the day of the presidential election, but rather for what is known as the electors. And these electors, once they are elected, will form what is known as the Electoral College, which will then elect the President of the US. However, unlike the indirect election, this electoral process does not have the same disadvantages of the indirect process, because the electors that will vote for the President are only elected to vote for the next president. Indeed, this is their only task, and they will vote for the president in the weeks that follows the election. So there isn't a large gap of time that elapses between their election and the election of the president. And so they truly represent the opinion of the people who elected them. But most importantly, these electors commit before being elected to vote for one of the candidates, and they always fulfill their commitment. So in a way or another, the US presidential electoral system is somewhere in between the direct and indirect process. And now we will see how this process takes place. As you know, the US is constituted of 50 states. Indeed, the US is a federation, meaning that it's a coalition of initially 50 independent countries who decided to unite to form a single country, which is the United States of America. Each of these states is allocated a certain number of electoral votes based on its population. The higher the population of a state, the more electoral votes it will have. For example, the state with the highest number of electoral votes is California, which has a population of 39.5%, and for this it's allocated 55 electoral votes. As Alaska is the state with the fewest electoral vote, as it only have 3 electoral votes because it has a population of only 730,000 Americans. Now let's talk a little bit about the Electoral College. The total number of electoral votes in the US is 538. These 538 electors, once elected, will form the Electoral College, which will elect the next president of the US. In order to be elected as a president, the candidate must get the majority of the vote of the Electoral College, which is 270 electoral vote. So in a way or another, it's the state that are electing the president rather than the people. And for this reason, it's very possible for a candidate to get the biggest number of or the highest number of popular vote, but end up losing the election. And this is what happened in 2016. And I will explain you how right now. So this is a table that shows the 2016 popular vote result. By popular vote, I'm meaning the votes of the US citizens. Here we're not talking about the electors or the college, we're talking about the vote of the US citizens. So Hilary Clinton was able to get 3 million votes more than President Trump, meaning that 3 million Americans voted for Hilary Clinton more than the Americans that voted for Donald Trump. And these were the result. Around 65 million votes for Hillary Clinton and 62 million votes for President Trump. However, despite Hillary Clinton doing better in the popular vote, she ended up losing the election, the US election, and by a big margin, by around 70 electoral votes. And the reason why this happened is because most of the state in the US, when it comes to the electoral vote, when it comes to allocating the electoral vote for a given candidate, follows the rule of winner takes all. What do I mean by winner takes all? Let's see this following table to understand better. So here you see the result the result of the presidential election in many of the US states. As you see, President Trump was able to win the state of Michigan by only 0.3%, the state of Pennsylvania by 0.7%, and the state of Wisconsin by also 0.7%. Despite these very small margin, when I say 0.3% and 0.7%, it's barely a few thousand of votes over millions of votes, so it's a very small margin. Despite these very small margin, President Trump ended up taking all the electoral vote of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, while Hilary Clinton won many of her state by a huge margin. For example, she won in California by more than 32%, meaning that she did better than Trump by millions of votes. And despite this, the result is the same. No matter how small is your win in a given state, you will end up winning all the electoral vote of the state. And so it does not really matter by how much you win the state. What matters is that you win the state. What matters is that you win the biggest number of electoral votes in order to be elected as a president. Well, is this process fair or unfair? You can have both, you can defend both opinions, but in my opinion, it's fair enough. Because as I said, the US is a federation, so you have many independent country or originally independent country who decided to unite to form one country, which is the USA. But in return of the fact that they let their independence go in order to form one country, you should give them a minimum of power. You should give them a minimum of right, and this minimum of right, this minimum of power is recognized to them by the electoral vote. So now you know how the US election, the US presidential election takes place, and in the upcoming weeks we will be studying in depth the 2020 election, the 2020 presidential election. We will be studying the state where both candidates were very close to each other and try to figure out why President Biden was able to win. And most importantly, this will help us to predict or to have an idea of what will be happening in the next election, whereas it's the 2022 Senate and Congress election or the 2024 presidential election. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you very soon.